We begin today with immigration, and as the government seeks to lift New Zealand out of economic stagnation, it's turning to wealthy foreigners in the hope that they will invest their capital here. Erica Stanford is the Immigration Minister, and she joins us now. Kia ora, Minister. Thanks very much for coming in.
You're very welcome.
Really appreciate your time. Wealthy foreigners, are they the answer to New Zealand's economic woes?
They're a very small part of the answer. There's a huge amount in immigration we need to be doing. If you think back a year ago when we came into office, we had net migration running at unsustainable levels, 130,000. We had migrant exploitation like we had never seen before. Processing times were awful. We didn't have the right skill mix of migrants that we were bringing in the country. You know, businesses were frustrated at the processing times. You fast forward to today, in order to make sure we can grow the economy and get the skilled people in that we need in order to do that, we've had to make sure that Immigration New Zealand are on their foils, and we've done that. We've done so much work in the last year in terms of getting those numbers under control, migrant exploitation under control, making sure that we're processing visas in reasonable times where we should be, and making sure that the skill mix of migrants are tilted towards higher skilled migrants. That is going to grow the economy. And you can talk about, you know, a couple of hundred wealthy migrant investors, which I'm sure you're about to do. They are a small part of a much bigger, broader work program.
Sure, but that was the big announcement that you made this week. So let's dig into some of those details.
Sure.
$5 to $10 million, depending on the risk level for these investors.
Yeah.
One of the categories in the $10 million category is government bonds.
Yes.
I mean, is investing in government bonds really going to create jobs and help New Zealand grow?
Well, there's a couple of things to unpack there. I mean, the first thing is that we have limited the choice of types of investments over the last few years with the new settings. And what you've seen is the numbers completely tank. And we've had 31 approvals and principles in 3 years, and we've had 70 million invested. If you take the year before COVID, we had a couple of hundred investors and we had $1.1 billion invested, right? That's the first thing to say. We need to increase the pool of people with skills and experience and capital into this country. But the second point is around the risk level. We know that migrants and investors to this country have different tolerance for risk. And to be honest with you, many of them just want to make sure they secure their visa. And they will say, look, actually, I'm quite happy to put my money in bonds, but what we do know is from research and anecdotal evidence, and it's not always been the best, which is why we've made sure we've built into this new policy data collection. What we do know, though, is while they are securing their visa, they're off investing in Kiwi startups and Kiwi businesses and higher risk. Their risk profile shifts over time, and what I don't want to do is close the door, which we have been doing, and say, look, I'm sorry. Actually, we're going to ignore the fact that even though you might come in and invest in bonds, that you actually do a number of other things.
OK, you've said in your press release that you want these people not just for their capital and skills, but to, quote, build a life for themselves and their family here.
Yes.
Doesn't that mean home ownership?
I actually believe that it does. And look, those conversations are ongoing. There are a couple of things. There's sort of the trifecta, if you think
hang on, let's just back up, because that's significant.
Yes.
You do believe that
Yes.
home ownership is part of this deal, or should be?
Look, I think that the clear message we've had from these incredible people with amazing skill and resource is that, yeah, they want to be able to have a base here. They want to invite their friends here and show off their home and raise their children here. And yes, that is a barrier, and that's why those conversations are being had at the moment.
Welcome to country, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou katoa.
Alan, thanks very much. Good evening. Can I just take a moment to acknowledge Alan and the great work that he's done as Dean of the Australian New Zealand School of Government.
We have an impact on people's daily lives.
Paul, thanks for that presentation. I had to stop scribbling furiously because it was going to throw me off course on my presentation. There are some extraordinary continuities between Australia and New Zealand that you mentioned. What I want to do is walk you through where I think immigration policy in Australia fits in terms of our open economic model. And I view the immigration program the way it's functioning now, with the emphasis on skill. Not just emphasis on skill, but the try before you buy aspect of it. Most of the recruiting we now do is onshore. So a bit over half the permanent settlers in Australia change categories. So they were temporary migrants before they settled, and that's occurred in the last couple of years. Now, I view the way the program has evolved, and it's sort of evolved out of sight of the public, and I think a lot of politicians are not that clued up on what it means themselves. I've given a couple of presentations now internally to the public service in Australia on precisely this topic, that I don't think people understand how profound the changes we've had over the last 15 years in particular are. Now, one way to think about the migration program today is that it's become the fifth pillar of the open model. Now, the open model, as you've heard Bob Hawke, Paul Keating and John Howard tell you ad infinitum, and we went one more time around the world for sport in a television documentary a couple of years ago for the ABC. It was essentially a process by which 4 of the main prices in the economy were taken off the cabinet table and handed over to the market. The floating of the dollar, the setting of interest rates independently of government by the Reserve Bank, wages set at the enterprise level, and of course through the removal of the tariff wall, the absence of any government control over import prices or the quantity of imports. I would add migration as the fifth pillar for the following reasons. The government today does not have the control over the migration problem that it once did. And that is because it's demand driven and most of it is set by the market. So the numbers that come in, the government can control the flow, but the actual numbers that come into Australia in any given year is actually determined by the market and by education institutions. And the numbers themselves are quite profound. The only way to really get your head around it is to understand that we're adding an extra 1 million people a decade because of overseas migration. In each decade after the Second World War, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s and the 90s, population grew by about 2 million a decade. So rate of growth is actually declining because the number is pretty static. And a bit over half of that population growth for each decade after the Second World War was net natural increase. Now, for the last 3 decades of the last 2 decades of the 20th century, I'll give you the net overseas migration figure. I'll annualise it for you just to make it a bit easier. It was a bit over 100,000 in the 80s, and it was around 80,000 in the 90s. Of course, there's an interruption of a very, very deep recession in the early part of the 90s there. The first decade alone of the 21st century, and you should be aware of this headline number, but understand what this thing means. Population didn't grow by 2 million a decade, it grew by 3 million a decade. Now, that extra million has come from overseas. Whereas in the previous decade, the 1990s, net overseas migration of about 80,000 a year, we got 180,000 a year in the first decade alone of the 21st century. Now, take the annual rate now, based on the data for the last 4 years, it's a bit over 200,000 a year. That is the big profound shift. And the reason, as I said, if you look at it as the fifth pillar and it's demand driven, growing uninterrupted for 25 years is one of the reasons why you'd be adding this many migrants. But the other reason we're adding this many migrants is that the Chinese and Indians are choosing us. And the Chinese and Indians are emigrating at a rate that has no comparison in human history outside of the 19th century. And think about what the Chinese and Indians are doing. These are 2 rising nations, but their middle class is emigrating for the same reasons roughly that the British were emigrating in the 19th century. The middle class is moving because they're leaving a political system that's not quite ideal for them, an environment that's degraded, cities that are overcrowded. They're actually moving for opportunity.
It's too hectic to walk here, and my throat hurts from the pollution. So I've jumped on the back of a cycle rickshaw and said, take me somewhere. Anywhere. Oh. Take me anywhere, sir, but not here. Take me home.
And even though notionally we're recruiting them, it's their choice to come here that is actually driving a lot of the policy challenges, I think, in the next few years for people. Now, that's just the headline figure. Now the detail. Today in Australia, there are a little over 1 million people born in either China or India. For the first time on record, that 1 million from the 2 biggest countries on earth outnumber the British in Australia. So that's a big stat. Now, the median age for an English-born Australian is about 54, 55. The median age for a Chinese or Indian-born Australian is in the mid-30s. It's a bit lower for the Indians, it's a bit higher for the Chinese. So half your English-born population in Australia, essentially retirees, more than half your Chinese and Indian-born population in Australia are in the process of becoming your new middle or even your elites. Now, this is the other part of the migration program I think very few politicians have got their heads around. Most of the migrants that arrive today don't come to Australia via the same route that pretty much we are familiar with. Story of my parents, story of pretty much, I'd imagine, a lot of people in this room. The post-war migration program begins with a low-skilled worker, and you measure the success of the program in two ways. The fact that the low-skilled migrant took a job, was able to acquire property, but critically, through their kids, their Australian-born kids, they overachieved. And we know that the kids of non-English-speaking immigrants outperform all others in their peer group. And that's a pretty stable statistic. It's not just an Australian story, it's actually a story you see played out around the world. Most of the migrants who have been arriving in the last 15 years don't start at the bottom and get to the top via their kids, they start at the top. Bob Gregory's made this point most recently, and if you haven't seen the slide presentation he gave to the Australian Melbourne Institute Prosperity and Opportunity Conference late last year, dig it out, because there's a particular statistic in there which it's quite mind-blowing if you think it through. The net addition of jobs in Australia, the net addition of full-time jobs in Australia since 2007, almost every one of those jobs has been taken by an overseas-born person. Now, think about what that means. There's obviously a bit of it doesn't mean that the migrant has taken the job of a local born. When I wrote a version of the story earlier for The Australian, we had this rotten headline on the front page that said, "Migrants take Aussie jobs." And I insisted on a correction the next day. Now, Bob's updated the data, and Bob's actually done a terrific job on this. Within the local born population, what's actually happening is that new entrants to the labour market are essentially replacing the retirees. So the net addition of the jobs are gone to the overseas born. Now, in any economy where you're sourcing your skill globally, you'd think, in a macro sense, the economy is thriving. But at the local level, and we'll probably deal with this a bit more in the question and answer, I don't want to flag too many thoughts here. There's a couple of issues to think through. So even though, as I say, it's the fifth pillar of the open model, I think it requires a more active government to deal with flows of people this grand. One of the reasons is, if your overseas born is landing on the top, the social hierarchy, you've got a big question to ask yourself about what you do with the rest of the population. The other thing is, and this is a story now that the Treasury are taking forever to get their heads around, and traditionally they don't want to get into the planning business, they don't want to get into the city's agenda. But if you think about what our cities are starting to look like now, and given that the population has been moving a lot quicker in the last 10 to 15 years than I think any government previously has had to cope with, we're now about to reach a tipping point in Sydney if we haven't already got there, and we're certainly reaching it soon in Melbourne, where this concept of livability that we have a couple of million. Now, I'm going to read you a line from The Economist, and it puts it in their report every year, and this is why we need to think about these things as public policy makers. Those that score best tend to be mid-sized cities in wealthier countries with relatively low population density. This can foster a range of recreational activities without leading to high crime levels or overburdened infrastructure. Now, I know internally most of the evidence at a state government level is when a city crosses about 5 million, 4 to 5 million. That's about the number, isn't it? Where you start to struggle to keep the city functioning. Now, I know in Sydney, of course, in fact, Mike Baird is trying to do something that Arthur Phillip tried in 1789. He's trying to move the centre of Sydney to Parramatta. It's ever been thus in Sydney that Sydney Cove was the wrong place to locate the centre. Now, the issue of population density, the issue of livability, the infrastructure story, doesn't actually affect the new arrival. Because remember where the new arrival is ending up. The new arrival is ending up in the inner city. the new arrival is ending up on the top of the pile, on the top of your social structure. So somebody leaving Mumbai or Beijing, the year-to-year loss in livability in a Melbourne or Sydney is not going to matter to them because their frame of reference is the mother country. Now, when I say there are implications for government, when I say that you need a more active government, this extra million people that were received in the last decade, and Ken Henry's made this point publicly much better than I would, the political system couldn't handle that extra million. Literally couldn't handle it. I quite often the case study in Victoria where the Bracks government at the turn of the 21st century thought Melbourne was about to resume its title as the world's most livable city, knew the population was coming, and guess what? Didn't build a public transport network to cater for it. And the problem that they've got now is that once you let something as simple, as basic as your public transport infrastructure fall behind population growth, it takes many years to catch it up. Now, at a political level, I can tell you the volatility in Victoria is all sourced to public transport. So we've had a one-term government on the coalition side. We had a Labor government that expected to win, got knocked off in 2010. Coalition gets rolled in 2014, and we've got a Labor government now running against the clock to try and deal with its public transport issue before the next election. When we look a lot further north, we see political volatility that is inside is driven by migration. The only other time in Australian history that happened was the 1850s. It's the only other time in Australian history that more than half the population growth over a consistent period, now it's about 10 years now, came from overseas was the 1850s, and that was a gold rush. Now in Sydney and Melbourne, of course, and even in Perth, 2 minutes, thanks. In Sydney and Melbourne and even in Perth, the overseas born are pushing 40% already. Now these are cities of many millions of people. The last time we had an overseas born population of that order in the colonies was the 1870s. And these are colonies. New South Wales and Victoria hadn't even reached 1 million each at this point. So we're running quite a challenging experiment in mass high-income diversity, but it does have implications for everybody else. Now, I'm just going to leave it at that because I know we flagged some questions in our discussions, and I know there's a collective intelligence in the room will outweigh anything that I might be able to add from this point on, so I'm also looking forward to the exchange. Thank you. I flagged it in the presentation. One of the big challenges, I think, and you see it in real time because of the quality of the bulk of the intake. Not everybody shares this story, but if the predominant migrant today, if the majority of migrants today are landing roughly in the middle or the very top of the social structure, you have very, very simple question to ask about how does the rest of the population keep up. Now, sadly, the Indigenous disadvantage story, which is almost impossible for governments to get their heads around, and you've just seen the sort of chopping and changing even on the Northern Territory issue, where you see something on TV, the thing that's in the back of the public mind suddenly becomes front of mind, which is that essentially 2% of the population is not sharing the story of the last 25 years or even the story of 220-something years. And so governments go, okay, another Royal Commission, hang on a minute, we didn't think that through, 2 commissions, not 1. 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, ask yourselves a couple of questions. Your tertiary sector in education is on a big revenue-driven model via overseas students. Your schools, especially as the kids of the skilled intake come into the system, your schools are starting to crowd out local-born kids, simply because there aren't enough schools. You know, and think the story essentially for most people who can default to the private system at great expense, expense to the household budget, is that they assume there'll be a place for their kid there if their kid doesn't get a selective school, or or you don't have a good public school in your area. Think about what's going to happen in the next few years where there's scarcity, where Australians previously assumed almost universal access. And this is the local-born population, not the Indigenous population, it's the local-born population I'm talking about. If you start to get to a situation in Australia where you have Indigenous plus local-born disadvantage, and it's driven primarily because we're on a default setting because the migration program is keeping the macro data ticking over, then take the anecdote of Victoria public transport system and then take it across the education system. You can't catch this thing up if you let it go. Mm-hmm. Literally can't catch it up. Because then you've got the political cycle taking over, where you start to get a lot of knee-jerk responses that say, cut the program. So that'll be my first thought, but I'm interested in what the New Zealand perspective is and how anyone has been thinking about these things in New Zealand.
Well, there's New Zealanders in the room who would be as competent as I am to answer it, but the New Zealand situation is the same, but there's a few complicating factors. So we do the same polling as Andrew has been doing, and this is for the Asian New Zealand Foundation, and the responses have been trending upwards, except for the Māori respondents, and they're trending down. So there's a political, cultural dimension in which they see some of the exclusion from the education market or the labour market as being an issue, but they're also deeply concerned that the diversification of New Zealand's demographic base is then going to change the balance. And I don't know whether you noticed, but that already the Asian communities of Auckland are larger than the combined Māori and Pasifika communities of Auckland.
To have the last say, and so over to you, because you're between Morning Smoko. So
okay, and I'm a New Zealander.
Excellent.
Two things. I think we're not anticipating the future. We met with the federal minister from Germany last year in Mexico City, of all places, and she explained to us why 1 million Syrian refugees, population supplementation, workers. I think countries like ours, particularly countries that are much more advanced in the ageing process, like Japan and Germany, are going to look at the systems that we've got for selecting and recruiting skilled migrants. This is a space that we've occupied for a long time. Don't expect it to continue. There's going to be a lot of international competition. But look at our source countries. If you look at Shanghai, if 2.1 births per woman is replacement fertility, the birth rate in Shanghai is at 0.7. It is not even at half. And if you look at what the Chinese government have done recently about tourism, which is to divert outward-bound tourists to inbound tourists, I think if you look at the demography of China, they're not going to allow their skilled middle-class people to continue to come to Sydney, Melbourne or Auckland in the next few years. That will be closed off, and I think it'll be closed off soon and rapidly. So I think we're in a particular phase, and we've been talking about demographic trends, but have a good look out there in the big wide world, because I think we're going to have some new challenges quite soon.
The seeds of New Zealand university education were planted in a regional pattern about 100 years ago. When elm and sycamore, stone tower and pinnacle began to rise into the Canterbury sky, the provinces of Auckland, Wellington and Otago also established universities to serve their own growing communities. So today, it's from the north and centre of the South Island that Canterbury draws most of its 4,000 students, although some of them come from other parts of New Zealand, the Colombo Plan countries and islands of the South Pacific.
Value the determination of prices
in a crowded lecture room or at a Faculty of Law tutorial, throughout the universities there's the same constant awareness of problems to be solved, of propositions to be stated and critically examined.
House of Representatives or with a referendum. What then should the courts take to be the effect of a supposed act, say, altering the definition of Maori for the purposes of the Electoral Acts which has not been passed by the necessary 3/4 majority.
In law, as in other disciplines, university studies encourage the testing of fact against fact, opinion against opinion.
In Section 189, Harrison, the Minister of Interior, is authority for that.
Well, sir, I'm not so sure about that. I think the authority is perhaps a bit thin. In the New Zealand case of...
Vital questions affecting the individual and the state, and the wider aspects of international relations, all provide subjects for discussion, debate, definition.
We must mean something by the word power.
Well, I was going to ask, Roseanne, why don't you use the word racism instead of microaggression?
Because they're two different things.
Yeah, microaggressions can be about other things, not just race. So it could be about your gender or your sexuality or other things.
So it could be a racist microaggression.
I think we're struggling at the moment in New Zealand in 2017 because we don't have the vocabulary to describe some of these things. I'm not sure I like microaggression. I think that might be one way of describing what's happening in public spaces. But there are two things that I would really urge people to think about. One is that our language, immigration, I've already questioned. The word Asian. I mean, it's just such a crude box or label, and we've got to find something other than that to describe parts of our community. I think we struggle in terms of what comes after biculturalism, and you know, what does multiculturalism in New Zealand look like? And please do not compare us with other countries. We are not like other countries. So even though we get echoes of Trump and the US, or of Brexit and what's happening in the UK or what's happening in Europe, our history is different. Our relationships are different. Our institutions and values are different. And by the way, our migration story is very different from practically everybody else.
You're listening to RNZ National and the first in the 2017 series Smart Talk from the Auckland Museum.